Hello everyone, welcome to the Light World Podcast, and I'm your host, LT World, and on this channel we talk about the things people don't like to talk about. We talk about politics, we talk about religion, and we talk about ideologies. If that sounds like something you're into, join us as we take a look at the things that drive culture.
Do you really despise religious belief?
I despise people whose belief in religion is so firm it justifies killing people.
Inside, 39 members of the Heaven's Gate cult had taken their own lives.
Once in a while I get people that really claim they don't believe in evolution. And my response generally is, why not?
We can't even begin to describe a living creature in anything resembling precise terms.
Where do the laws of physics come from?
It's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis.
Does God exist? What is the difference between the material and immaterial world? Seriously, what is the difference? There are 4 chemicals associated with happiness, but can those chemicals accurately describe what happiness actually is? There's hormones correlated with sex, but do hormones accurately describe romance, love, and actually explain the sensation of sex? There are neurons that are constantly firing and are associated with thought, but do they accurately describe the actual process of thinking? And what about the idea of ourself and this idea of consciousness? How does that correlate with the material world? How do the material and immaterial relate? How are they different? How are they associated with one another? How can this be all explained? There are 2 common ways that this problem is addressed: the naturalistic route and the more theistic route. The naturalistic route will say that yes, at the root of all things, at the root of all immaterial things as we understand them, is the physical. The physical and natural world can explain consciousness, thoughts, and just feelings and stuff like that. While the theistic route will say, actually, human beings are made up of some sort of spirit and physical bodies, and there's some sort of relationship between the two. Let's start with the naturalist. Let's start with that sort of approach to things. The philosophy is actually quite simple, even though sometimes the physical science can be complex or can be more technical. But the philosophy is rather simple. Everything that we experience as far as consciousness goes is all in the brain. It's the brain that can explain away everything. Humans observe things and take in stimulus, which then causes neurons to fire and transfer information through energy or electric waves or whatever you want to call it. And then as that energy travels through, that causes certain responses in the body, and those responses then become actions or tell the nervous system to do certain things. And then we get this sensation of thought or sensation of feeling, sensations of whatever it may be, that are correlated with these physical phenomenon. And at the end of the day, a lot of naturalists will say that is what it is. It is a physical experience. And normally the biggest evidence that is used on the naturalist side of things is neuroscanning or psychological studies or neurological studies, where they do tests and they do similar things where they will take patients and they will do some sort of stimulus, or they might do something more psychological where they expose them to certain images or have them recite memories, and they'll see what parts of the brain are being engaged. And normally, most of the time, certain parts of the brain are being engaged for different things, whether that be vision, whether that be for thinking about emotions or fear or sadness or happiness. Different parts of the brain are normally being engaged at different areas and different times based on different stimulus. And there's normally some sort of correlation there. And the correlation is normally really strong. There's a strong correlation between certain feelings and parts of the brain that are being used. And there's strong correlations between certain types of thoughts or memories and what parts of the brain are being used. Definitely with sleep, same thing. What parts of the brain are being used while sleeping. Stuff like that. So there's a lot of evidence for correlation between immaterial experiences and the brain and the physical experiences themselves. Obviously, though, that's not normally where the argument will end, and theists will come back with some sort of arguments. One being correlation doesn't always equate to exact causation. So there might be a relationship, for instance, between an immaterial and material world, but does not necessarily mean that the material world is causing the immaterial directly. It might not be the root cause of all the immaterial experiences that we have. So correlation doesn't always necessarily mean causation. And we can't always just assume, just because we see some sort of correlation, that we understand the root cause of a certain problem or a certain situation. However, there are some more philosophical responses or rebuttals from the theistic side that do crop up. And one that I think is intriguing is the isness versus aboutness type of philosophy. So I'm going to allow William Lane Craig, who has spoken before on this, I've pulled clips from before on this podcast, to kind of explain this in a more direct and concise way.
God is the best explanation of intentional states of consciousness in the world. Philosophers are puzzled by states of intentionality. Intentionality is the property of being about something or of something. It signifies the object directedness of our thoughts. For example, I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think of my wife. No physical object has this sort of intentionality. A chair or a stone or a glob of tissue like the brain is not about or of something else. Only mental states or states of consciousness are about other things. As a materialist, Dr. Rosenberg recognizes this fact and so concludes that on atheism, there really are no intentional states. Dr. Rosenberg boldly claims that we never really think about anything. But this seems incredible. Obviously, I am thinking about Dr. Rosenberg's argument. This seems to me to be a reductio ad absurdum of atheism. By contrast, on theism, because God is a mind, it's hardly surprising that there should be finite minds. Thus, intentional states fit comfortably into a theistic worldview. So, we may argue, one, if God did not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. Two, but intentional states of consciousness do exist. Three, therefore, God exists.
Now, to apply that logic a little bit more directly to the topic of consciousness in the brain, is that the brain is a physical thing, and therefore, in of itself, is just is. It can't actually be about anything. It just is itself. However, the mind is not just of itself. It actually has to be about other things and constantly thinking and existing on the thought of other things and so forth. So, in that case, the isness and aboutness applied to consciousness and to the brain and to the mind is the brain is and the mind is about. And using the logic that he sort of uses is that since the brain is physical, it can't be about anything. And since the mind is not physical, it can be about things. And that's essentially how it would apply to the brain and to the mind. I didn't come across, while I was researching and studying, any real strong argument against William Lane Craig's argument. However, I did kind of think of something that may be raised by people on the other side. Namely, just because the premise of that argument may be flawed in the sense of there might be actual physical properties that allow for consciousness to exist, and I'll get into that a little bit later actually. And so therefore the premise itself might not be accurate, that the physical world can produce consciousness, the physical world can produce aboutness, and the idea that material must be isness, it could be flawed. And we'll talk about that a little bit later because there's a few propositions as of how that might actually be the case. But before we jump into the rebuttals from the atheistic side on some of the theistic arguments I presented today so far, I want to cover one more for the theistic side that is often brought up, and that's namely medical records of out-of-body experiences or states of consciousness during surgeries where people were dead or had no brain stimulus or whatever you might call it. Craig Keener, who has PhD in biblical studies, PhD in the origins of Christianity, stuff like that. He knows a lot about history and has taught a lot on the subject. And he has a two-volume series called Miracles, where he documents and records a bunch of different historical accounts of miracles. And a section or a bunch of these miracles are medical cases that were written, peer-reviewed medical journal presentations of out-of-body experiences or consciousness while people were clinically dead. Namely, that they had no neurological stimulus happening. Their brain was not active and therefore presumably dead, or their heart stopped and they flatlined and their brain was not active and so forth, and they were dead for all purposes, and then they eventually came back to life, or they were resuscitated, whatever you might want to call it. However, there have been multiple cases in medical journals, as recorded in Miracles and recorded elsewhere, of people having recorded or stating or telling doctors of their consciousness during the surgery. And to go on to prove these cases, there have been cases of, for instance, there was a case of when someone came out of their body, had an out-of-body experience during surgery. They were clinically dead during the time. They shouldn't have been able to experience any sort of consciousness if the brain had to do with consciousness. and they were ascending from the table. They could see what the surgeons were doing and stuff, and they were able actually to read a serial number on the top of the machine, which they would not have been able to see at any point during any point of the surgery, or when walking in, after, anything. They wouldn't have been able to see it at any point. And they memorized the serial number, and they could recite it exactly to the doctors coming out of the surgery. And there have been other cases of people being able to, say, ask about the crash that happened in Los Angeles during the hour of their surgery, and they didn't see news or anything up to that moment, and they were able to recite things that happened that they would not have known about otherwise, unless they were able to actually go out of their body. Different cases of the sort. So there have been miraculous cases or unexplainable cases when people were brain dead, but yet still experiencing consciousness during the surgery and able to basically prove it through having knowledge that wouldn't have been possible if they were clinically brain dead and not conscious. So those are often brought up as arguments for the spiritual, or at least for a consciousness that is not purely materialistic in nature from the theistic side. Of course, there are arguments to these arguments from atheists oftentimes, and the one set of arguments I will cover in a future episode about miracles, and so we'll dive into miracles in one episode and dedicate it to that. So as far as out-of-body experiences go, I will have some of those arguments be covered in a future episode about miracles. However, oftentimes when it comes to arguments like the states of consciousness, or as far as the hospital experiences go, there is one that often is brought up even outside of just miracles as a specific argument. And that is namely the argument of the God of the gaps. Just because we don't understand how something happens doesn't mean God did it. And whenever you assert that God did something, that is just you trying to cover up your ignorance. A problem that is often seen with this sort of argument is that it's not always applicable to every case. So there is evidence, or there is reason to believe philosophically, and to even a certain extent scientifically and medically, that there might be some sort of spiritual element involved. It may not be 100% proven, but it's not a stretch to say it is possible. You can't then also make what I may just term here as the atheist of the gaps argument, that God did not do it, or say absolutely that God couldn't have done it, because you don't have any evidence that he didn't either. At the very least, you could just have to say it's a mystery and we don't know. But it is not then foolish to postulate that there could be potentially some sort of spiritual realm in the case of, for instance, consciousness, because of these out-of-body experiences. At the very least, you could say it's a mystery. However, going back to an argument I was referencing to in regards to the physical being able to actually explain consciousness, there have been some people who are proposing a theory that may be able to explain at least some levels of consciousness within the material world, and no surprise, it has to do more with sort of the quantum realm and quantum physics and stuff like that. It is called, by what if I pronounce it properly, is panpsychism. On the video, I'll just put the spelling up there for you. Panpsychism, and it essentially says that there is low levels of consciousness in all matter and in all atoms. I think it would be understood as some sort of energy. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but it is it's a theoretical proposition. But when I looked into it, it seems about as evidenced or as solid as any other sort of theistic argument, if not even weaker as far as evidence goes. So it doesn't really have any sort of strong leg. It doesn't seem to have any sort of strong evidence in this case. It's just mostly just a theory that's thrown out there that could maybe explain something at some point if evidence comes its way. But right now, it seems mostly like an almost semi-empty theory by what I could best tell from what I was looking at. To conclude, I think it's actually a fairly strong argument to say that the consciousness does help at least support the existence of some sort of spiritual world. Whether or not to say that God is necessary for the spiritual world to exist, I don't think you can necessarily go that far, but I think it is a strong argument against pure naturalism in of itself. There is no good logical explanation from a scientific, purely naturalistic standpoint as of why we experience immaterial things like feelings, emotions, and consciousness and stuff like that. There hasn't been any really big breakthrough scientifically that can explain it. And a lot of times people will turn to psychology, but oftentimes psychology just uses words to describe immaterial things that can't really be explained, and it's just changing of words rather than giving an actual explanation because they just want to avoid the word spiritual. And so there is a lot of times just this idea that there's nothing really in the physical world that can accurately fully describe consciousness, and there does seem to be this relationship between the two. And also from a philosophical standpoint, it's hard for me at least to wrap my head around the idea that an immaterial world could exist in a purely material world. The actual existence of immaterial feelings and sensations cannot be explained by chemicals. Those chemicals themselves have no, as the argument goes, no aboutness. There just is. But there's this experience of aboutness that we're thinking, we're feeling things that can't be explained purely by material things because they are immaterial experiences. So to say that the world is completely material doesn't seem to align up with our actual experiences as human beings. And so there seems to be at least some sort of spiritual world or some sort of metaphysical world out there. Is God the creator of it? It wouldn't be a stretch to say he is, because God in and of himself would be immaterial and a mind and a consciousness of his own right. It doesn't necessarily get you all the way there, but it is a good evidence and I think a strong case for the case of as far as theism goes. However, I want you guys to keep looking into these arguments yourselves, keep delving into it, and just keep thinking and use that consciousness of yours to keep delving into the arguments. And as always, friends, I want you to keep going out there and lighting the world. If you would like to learn more about how to light the world, subscribe to whatever podcast platform you're listening to and follow along, because we would love to have you, and we continue to cover topics like this down the road, and you can grow in your understanding and in your knowledge of these different important topics that we deal with every day. You can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter. On these outlets, I ask questions, I run polls, people can DM me, and I'm going to do some more special content on there anyway. So definitely follow along there and join the Light the World community. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel if you like video content, and I post some extra videos on there occasionally. So follow along, join the community, and we're going to have a good time learning more about the important topics of life.